It's not gone, but we'll see is the we'll see. Good. Well, I think I'd better begin. Actually, I better take my watch off to make sure that I don't go dreadfully over time. Look, since it's the last lecture, just a deep word of thanks to Trinity for inviting me, and to John Maranlund for organising everything, and to Emma for organising yesterday. I know what it's like to be in the middle of term time and forced to organise these kind of things, so I'm genuinely grateful. And it's lovely to see old friends. So, welcome to everyone. All right. I call this lecture The First World War and Now. It's actually the First World War for 55 minutes and now for 5. But still, questions on anything, you know, whether I'll be able to answer them is a different matter. All right, I will start with Russia because Russia inevitably is what I know best. If you're looking at Russian foreign policy before the First World War, that pre-war decade, I think you can see really three key elements going into it. One is security. One is what you might call either ambitions or interests, and the third is identity. Security means basically cleaving to a conception and a reality of a European balance of power for fear of German hegemony. Ambitions, interests, were the top priority after 1905, in the 9 years between the end of the Japanese War and the First World War, are undoubtedly the Straits. Trying at a minimum to ensure that no other great power gets control over them, trying at a minimum to ensure that Russian warships can in some orderly way go in and out of the Black Sea. Of course, the maximum ambition, which Grigory Trubetskoy, the head of the Near Eastern Department of the Foreign Ministry, certainly entertained, is actually annexing the Straits and Constantinople for Russia. Identity, above all else, the idea that Russia is a great power, a great empire, and the two terms mean the same almost in pre-1914 Europe. In other words, a country whose elites can feel proud that their status is equal to the status of any other power and its elites, that they have a place in history, that they will play their part in determining the future of the human race, part of the Great Power Club. You know, when Alexander Izvolsky, the just retired as foreign minister, then ambassador in Paris, writes to Stolypin, the chairman of the Council of Ministers in 1910, you know, after 1905, we actually had two alternatives. Either we could, as the Kaiser pressed us, rejoin the Dreikaiserbund, the conservative alliance of the Germanic imperial monarchs in Russia, at which point we would basically have been the junior in a group of three. Or we could take the path which was perhaps more risky, which was allying with the French and therefore almost inevitably with their allies, the British. That was the path which was worthy of the heirs of Peter and Catherine, the Russia for which we feel proud, and that is it in a nutshell. That, I would say, is the most important element in identity, but behind it comes the idea of Russia as the leader of Slav civilization and of a Slav, if you like, camp. Well, two things immediately to be said. Firstly, that security, interests, ambitions, and identity are often very hard to distinguish. Look, the Balkan League, the attempt to create an alliance of Balkan Slavs on Russia's side, under Russia's guidance, against what is perceived as the Germanic, Austro-German attempt to basically dominate the Balkan Peninsula and East Europe as a whole. That is obviously a question of identity. It is equally obviously a question of balance of power, geopolitics. The Russians are entirely explicit about the idea that if they can create and maintain a Balkan League, it will help in their eyes to rectify the imbalance of power between themselves and the Germanic empires. And it is also common sense to realize that if through creating such a league you control the Balkans, that is a very useful addition to any conflict which comes up over Constantinople. The other, I think, equally obvious point to make is that actually the fundamental elements in Russian policy are not that much different to the foreign policy of any of the other great powers. Balance of power is as much, a priority in London and Paris as it is in Petersburg, as much as a shibboleth, if you want to say, of course, that we can debate. Certainly, Russia's ambitions at Constantinople and the Straits are a destabilizing element in European politics. But, you have to put all this within the context of the era. This, after all, is the era in which the British have annexed the Suez Canal and have turned virtually the entire littoral of the Indian Ocean into either direct colonies or protectorates. It's the era in which the Americans have staged basically a coup in Panama and have built the canal across the isthmus. And I think it is fair to say that actually Russian interests were even more fundamentally involved in the Straits than were the British in Suez or the Americans in Panama, for the simple reason that Russian exports could only get out that way. They were simply too bulky to get out by land. Whereas in the last resort, the British, even in the First War, certainly in the Second, could, at a cost, go round the Cape, and the Americans round the other Cape, of course. The third point, identity, well, I think you can see world politics from the 1880s, perhaps, down to 1991, and to some extent beyond, as being as much as anything a conflict between three blocs, which are simultaneously geopolitical, ethnic, and to some extent ideological. The Anglo-Americans win in the end because the vast resources of the British Empire and of the United States hugely outweigh the resources either of the Germanic or of the Russo-Slav or even Russo-Communist bloc. Russia is unique, really, not in the fact that it is trying to form and lead one of these three geopolitical blocs, but by its weakness. The Slavic bloc, firstly, is not united. The second Slav people, the Poles, are at daggers drawn with the Russians. Even Orthodox Slav bloc, the two major Orthodox communities in the Balkans, the Bulgarians and the Serbs, are at each other's throats. And actually, even if the Slavic bloc had been united, its resources would not remotely have matched the Germanic bloc, which is, after all, the leading element in the European economy, let alone the simply enormous potential resources of the Americans and the British combined. If you want the best single statement of Russian foreign policy, it is a speech given by the new Foreign Minister, Alexander Izvolsky, in February 1907 to the State Defense Council. This is a very small group, above all, of generals and admirals. The Foreign Minister is there in order to tell the military leadership what Russian priorities are and how the Army and Navy need to defend those priorities. This is a new institution created in 1905 precisely in order to try and avoid the chaotic failure to coordinate diplomacy, military and naval policy before 1905, resulting in the catastrophe against Japan. The basic issue tackled in this speech and facing the State Defense Council is whether to put a priority on Asia, above all East Asia, or on Europe and the Middle East, meaning about, well, the Balkans, really. Izvolsky faces generals who are absolutely paranoid about the vulnerability of Russia's possessions in East Asia after the defeat by Japan. He faces at least one of the key admirals, Fedor Dubasov, who basically states the case which underpinned Russian policy in the 1890s, which is prioritizing the Far East in the belief that the future belongs to the Asia-Pacific region. Russia's future belongs in the development of its Asian-Siberian empire, and that therefore this is where Russia should devote most of its energies, to the extent possible simply closing down all possible causes of conflict in Europe and the Middle East. Izvolsky says a number of things. He says, firstly, that Russia cannot be a true Asia-Pacific power in any conceivable future, or any foreseeable future. It will be decades or generations, he says, before Russia could really create the infrastructure to sustain a navy in the Pacific which could compete with the Americans and the Japanese. He also, though, says that foreign policy is not just a question of power or even of power in economics. It is also a matter of culture and identity. The Russians are a European people, he says. If you want to make Asia your priority, the first thing you must do is change the location of our capital from Petersburg to Omsk or Chelyabinsk. This is rhetorical, of course. But he also, and this is really the most telling point, says in East Asia, we must avoid war. You know, we cannot afford conflict. In East Asia, we can control events. The Japanese are willing to do a deal with us. We can achieve security simply through diplomacy if we so wish. And indeed, he did do that. On the contrary, he says, in the Middle East, in the Balkans, and in East Central Europe, we cannot control events. In the next 10 to 15 years, the crisis of the Ottoman and Austrian empires is going to come onto the agenda and very possibly be finalized, resolved. We cannot stand aside. The interests of Russia in these issues are simply too great. If we stand aside, we would be like Persia. And that is not just a question of status, core Russian interests would be affected. And it seems to me that that is the basic logic of Russian policy up to 1914. In 1910, Izvolsky is succeeded by the deputy minister, Sergei Sazonov. But Sazonov carries on Izvolsky's policy. That is why he is chosen. He had formerly been Sazonov's, he had formerly been Izvolsky's assistant twice. He had formerly been Benkendorf's assistant as well, the ambassador in London. And those are the two key figures in the foreign ministry driving policy. He was the brother-in-law of the Prime Minister Stolypin. He's there as a force for continuity who can to some extent be controlled by Benkendorf, Izvolsky and Sazonov, and Izvolsky. As to the issue of the upcoming crisis of the Austrian and Ottoman empires, a very interesting point is that the Germans themselves came to Russia, to the Russians in 1900 and again in 1905, saying, what are we going to do if the Austrian Empire collapses? And there is actually a fascinating correspondence, both within the top level of Russian decision makers and in reply to the Germans. I won't go on to that now. It seems to me that the issue we're talking about here, empire and nation, the way in which the two are juxtaposed, threaten each other, you name it, in conflict, but not always in conflict, is one of the key structural elements, one of the two key structural elements, which is most important in explaining the onset of the First World War. I split it into two sections, really, one of which is not the familiar story, or not simply the familiar story, of nationalism's challenge to empire. It's more complicated. The point is that in this era, empire seems to be the key to international power, and that for a number of reasons. It's partly to do with globalization. It's to do with the fact that the European economies are enormously dependent, far more than in the past, on extra-European trade, raw materials, you name it. Even more to the point, it is because of technology. You now have, above all the railway, but also the telegraph, deep mining technologies, all sorts of things, you now have the means to colonize and exploit the resources of continental heartlands. That is why the leading British geopolitical thinker of the age, Halford Mackinder, argued that the world was coming to the end of the so-called Columban era, the era when sea power dominated the globe, and the future would probably now belong to the great Eurasian land empires, Russia, perhaps Germany, China, etc. But probably above all else, this perception is owed to understanding of the implications of the rise of the United States. Once the United States had survived the great crisis of the Civil War, and then gone through 3 generations of very rapid economic and demographic growth, it was clear to any thinking statesman in Europe that no purely European country was going to be able to match American resources, or be a true great power in the 21st century, unless it in turn could acquire continental scale resources. That could only mean empire. And that is the fundamental geopolitical underpinning of the age of high imperialism. But there is a horrible dilemma, because at the same time as empire appears the name of the game as regards international power, the nation appears to be the best way to legitimize elites, solidify communities, give citizens some sense of commitment to the state, etc., etc. It is absolutely true that nationalism is exploited by elites and governments in order to try and win mass support in the age of growing mass politics and literacy, to combat socialism, even sometimes to combat liberalism, though empire and liberalism do also ally themselves to some extent. But it is, I think, a mistake to imagine that nationalism just comes from above. What the nation and nationalism often does is to give individuals in an increasingly atomized urban world some sense of community, some sense of having a place in history, some sense that their own brief and humdrum lives are part of some bigger and sometimes even more heroic historical drama. One could go on about this for a long time. Trying to ensure the commitment of citizens to the state, to the polity, seems to require this kind of mobilizing element, and the evidence seems to be coming from below as well. So you have the wonderful problem of trying somehow to put together empire, which is by definition multi-ethnic, and nationalism, which to be effective has almost always got to have a strong ethno-linguistic historical content. Who has ever been really willing to die for the purely civic nation? Not many people, I suspect. And people, thinkers tie themselves in knots. Pyotr Struve, the leading intellectual of the Russian sort of center-right center, with his endless theories about empire-state-nation for Russia. But not just there. John Seeley, empire federalism, and the English, Treitschke, Leroy Beaulieu, they're all trying to manage this. And I suppose you could say that the most frightening aspect of all of this is that, of course, they were right. If you look at the countries which matter in the contemporary world, it is the United States, China, potentially India, and possibly the European Union, if it can manage the challenge of combining European continental scale and creating a legitimate European polity, effective as well, but you can't be effective unless you're legitimate, in the continent which created modern nationalism and is still very much enthralled to it. So, these geopolitical thinkers had a point, as you might say. But then there is the other side, the one which will be more familiar, of the empire against nation debate. It is, in other words, minority nationalism's threat to the empires which dominated the globe in 1914. Now, I realize that on the whole, the fashion among historians recently, last 20 years, has been to deny nationalist teleological historiography, and to stress the viability of empire and the importance of other forms of community and allegiance. And I am 101% in favour of that, both in terms intellectually and 121% in favour sort of emotionally in terms of my own interests and everything. Nevertheless, one must not exaggerate. Nationalism has proved an enormously powerful factor in world politics in the 20th century and shows no sign of going away. Indeed, I fear under the stress of climate change and other factors, immigration above all, it's going to grow, not weaken in strength. I always used to have brandy in these things. I should have forgotten my dignity and put brandy in. My throat survives better. Look, the immediate causes of the First World War, or in a sort of obvious way, are the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in North Africa and in the Balkans, which opens up, apart from anything else, a geopolitical hole in the Balkans, which the Austrians and Russians are in competition to fill. In the Austrian case, you have not just the sense that the Balkan Wars have been the victory of Romania and Serbia, which not just are not, well, they're not trustworthy because they also have large Romanian and Serb populations inside the Habsburg Empire who will increasingly look to Bucharest and to Belgrade for support. So there is in the Austrian case a combination both of an external geopolitical threat and of an internal one. And as much as anything, the First World War starts because the Austrian leadership decides, actually, it's all there in black and white in the Austrian documents. September 1913, there was a meeting of the Joint Ministerial Council which says, you know, the success of Serbia in the two Balkan wars is an enormous threat to our survival. We must take the first opportunity to destroy Serbia as a Russian surrogate and as a threat. We can only do that when the Serbs do something horrible to us, which will enable us to go to Berlin and say, hey, this is enough, we've got to fight. And that is what the assassination of Franz Ferdinand to an extent did. I mean, I'm being, as you might say, a little bit shorthand, but I think that is a fair summary. And actually, it seems to me in many ways what the Austrian elite does in July 1914 is very similar to what the Anglo-French elites do in, governments do in 1956 over Suez. You've in both cases got imperial elites reacting to geopolitical decline and nationalist challenges with a combination of arrogance, miscalculation, and panic. Which, you know, is, I think, yes, I think that's a pretty fair comparison, really. Certainly it is important to remember that the challenge which faces the Austrians in 14 is a challenge which other European imperial governments and elites are also facing. This is, after all, the moment when the British political systems comes closest to breakdown over the Ulster crisis. You know, you do not need German geopolitical intellectuals to tell the British that they have a very small metropolis and an enormous distant periphery in their empire. Irish nationalism is the threat at the very centre of the metropolitan, already small polity. That helps to explain why the Conservatives are prepared to do almost anything to block it, to block Home Rule, or certainly to block any idea of Ireland setting off towards some sort of sunset of independence. The Russians, paranoid already about the Polish nationalism, Baltic nationalism, they lost control of the Transcaucasus in the Revolution of 1905 briefly as well. And above all, looming over the horizon is Ukrainian nationalism. Not at the top of the agenda yet, by any means, but it is very interesting that both Struve and the most intelligent public intellectual on the right, intelligent but nasty, deeply nasty, Mikhail Menshikov, they both see Ukrainian nationalism as the biggest threat of all, because of, as I said in a previous lecture, if the Ukrainians are a separate nation, then the Russians are only 44% of the population of the empire. The Russian Empire is beginning to look like the Ottoman Empire or the Austrian Empire, and Russian elites won't accept that. And then there is the fact that, you know, most of the empire's export agriculture, most of its coal and iron industry is in what is now described as Ukraine. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a great power. There's a very interesting discussion again in the Austro-Hungarian Joint Ministerial Council in summer 1912. Just as the Balkan Wars are looming over the horizon. And there is a considerable degree of consensus between Petersburg and Vienna on this issue. They're both terrified of a Balkan War because they know how easily it could escalate and become a European war, a great war. And the Austrian ministers, Austro-Hungarian ministers, are beginning to sound a bit optimistic about a rapprochement between Austria and Russia. And Berchtold, who had been ambassador in Petersburg and was now the foreign minister, says, I wouldn't get too excited. Today, the Balkans are the really hot issue between us and Russia, but in the longer run, it will be the Ukrainian issue. Because for Russia, Ukrainian national identity, a separate Ukrainian national identity, is a dagger at the heart of the empire. And it is us, we, in the Habsburg Empire, who have a quarter of the Ukrainians in this world, to whom we are allowing, as we allow all our nationalities, free development. And therefore, willy-nilly, and we can't stop it, but our internal policy will be perceived by Russia as an existential threat. All right, so Austria, after the assassination, turns to Germany. Just in a way what happens in 1956. You know, the big difference is that in 1956, Big Brother in Washington tells the British to stop and uses, as you might say, rather powerful inducements to force them to do so. In 1914, Big Brother in Berlin doesn't just try and stop the Austrians. It actually, if anything, doesn't just give them a green light. It gives them a bit of a push. So that gets me on to the second big structural factor, in my opinion, which explains the coming of the First World War. And that is the balance of power. Again, I'm repeating, I hope briefly, something I said in my first lecture. But it seems to me that we still live today in the world order which emerged at the end of the 7 Years' War, and end of, well, it's, 1760s, second half of the 18th century. Western, or European predominance in the world, Anglo predominance within the Western community. That predominance rooted above all in British maritime, financial, commercial, and to a certain extent manufacturing power. That British predominance confirmed by the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and then greatly boosted by the fact that Britain is the first industrial nation. And then as the Industrial Revolution spreads eastwards in Europe, as it was bound to do, it begins to undermine or challenge the bases of British predominance. Firstly, it goes to Germany, and then by the first 15 years of the 20th century, it's moving eastwards into the Russian Empire very fast. By 1913, Russia is the only European country whose share of global GDP is still growing in percentage terms. Even Germany is falling back in percentage terms because of the immense expansion of the United States. So it seems to me that an absolutely crucial factor in 1914 is that the German leadership believes that though they are the potential hegemon of Europe in 1914, give it a generation, if Russian economic development goes on at its present pace, and there's no particular reason to imagine why it shouldn't, short of revolution, of course, in chaos, then Russia is going to be unbeatable and undoubtedly at least East Central Europe's dominant power in a generation's time. Better today, when we might well win, we probably will, than tomorrow when we'll certainly lose. That seems to me to be a big part of the logic of German decision-making. And there's a narrower perspective as well, meaning that the Russo-Japanese War and then the Revolution of 1905 leads to a dramatic eclipse of Russian power. The enormous growth of the economy, plus some degree of political stabilization subsequently, seems to be showing that, Russia's like this. And of course, that feeds into Russian armaments programs. In 1913, the Germans actually introduce a wealth tax in order to boost fiscal revenue in order to get their army up to scratch. The Russians promptly respond with the second great program, which makes it look that in about 5 years, at last, Russia's enormous predominance in terms of simple human beings will be able to be conscripted into the army, properly trained and properly armed. And that adds to the German perception that it's far better to strike now. It's worth asking, whether the Germans were actually correct. And I think, it's not entirely clear. If you look at Russian and German shares of global GDP in 1914 and 1939, German perceptions seem indeed justified. The German share of global GDP in 1939 is proportionally much less than it was in 14, and Russian is much greater, despite the revolution, civil war, chaos, the lot. I actually think that if it hadn't been for the First World War and the revolution, you would have had something roughly similar in terms of the trajectories. Look, Russia has what? 3 times the population, vastly greater raw materials, etc., etc., etc. It is also true that the Russian army is going to be a great deal more formidable in 10 years' time, probably, than it is now, simply because these big budgets are going to allow, as I say, many more troops to be, well, many more men to be mobilized and properly trained and equipped. Key areas of weakness, such as heavy artillery, are all part of this great program. It's also true, though, that although this program is coming through, the Germans can play it both ways, because they can feel we can risk it now, because after all the Russians will be very scared of revolution. So probably, we can actually force advantages now, which we won't be able to force in 10 years' time. We can risk it. We can risk it, because if the Russians do fight us, great, better now than later. It's, again, undoubtedly true, and the Serbians say this explicitly to the Russians in 1913, after their victory in 2 Balkan wars. They say, look, for God's sake, don't start a war now, or we mustn't either for the next 3 or 4 years, because we've lost half our cadre in two wars. We've also doubled our territory, or whatever it is, population. We need a sufficient breathing space to organise an army to take in all this big new population area that we've conquered. Give it 5 years, and we will have 500,000 well-trained, experienced troops on Austria's southern front. So, that is another reason why you might think in Berlin that now better than later. And then there's the fact that the Germans see Austria-Hungary not necessarily on the verge of collapse, but certainly in a decline whose seems to be more or less preordained. So, it's not as if when the Germans make these decisions, it's all complete nonsense. It isn't. But there is another side. In the first place, it is nonsense to imagine that Russia in any near future is going to start a war. There is no Russian minister between 1905 and 1914 who you could say belongs to a war party. Firstly, they're much too scared of revolution. But secondly, also, they believe that the future is on their side if they can avoid revolution. They already have a vast empire. They already are on the cusp of developing. Siberia, no. They're not going to move. They're not going to attack Germany, not for many years to come. Secondly, France is in relative terms in decline, as the Russian embassy in Paris reports to Petersburg. In terms of population, in terms of industry, France is falling further and further behind Germany, potentially also further and further behind Russia. It's also the case that, and this again is the more temporary issue, Poincaré and the sort of right centre, the nationalist right centre, which came to power as a result of the Second Morocco crisis, is not likely to stay in power much longer. And this can be crucial. Remember that in the Bosnian crisis of 1908, the French government refused to back Russia, essentially, if it came to a war with Austria and Germany over a Balkan issue. In 1912 and 13, the French government, and then again crucially in 1914, the French government tells Russia in advance that if a European war breaks out as a result of an Austro-Russian clash in the Balkans, France will give its full support to Russia, regardless of whether the Germans join in or not. Well, if that guarantee is going to be removed, Russian policy is going to be, I think, a good deal more reticent. And then there's the British. There are people in this room who know more about British foreign policy than I do. But it seems to me that there is a very good evidence that British policy is beginning to move back towards a more traditional position of trying to be the balancer between the continental powers, precisely because, in part, they see the growth of Russian power, fear Russian and French intransigence, at least, and partly because once Germany is forced to spend large amounts of money on bringing its army up to scratch, it cannot also carry on the naval race against Britain. By 1913, it is absolutely clear that the British have won the naval race, hands down. The German High Seas Fleet is no longer a true threat. The British know it and the German leadership know it. The German leadership can't say it for domestic political reasons. It is also true that the British and Germans surreptitiously are beginning to work together on a common policy towards the Ottoman Empire. The British are rebuilding the Ottoman Navy and the Germans the Ottoman Army. The British and Germans have come to a deal over the Berlin-Baghdad Railway and over, therefore, policy in the Middle East and the Gulf. There is evidence, I think, at the top of the Foreign Office, the way that opinions are shifting, that if certainly the Liberals stay in power, you are going to get a certain distancing of Britain from certainly Russia, to some extent even France, but certainly Russia, partly because the agreement with Russia is threatened by disagreements between London and Petersburg over Persia. So there is room for optimism as well, and the issue becomes, why is it that it is the pessimistic analysis which wins out so catastrophically in Berlin in 1914? And here I think, you do have to retreat from the realm of structure, retreat from the realm of rational explanation, and begin to look at, to an extent, individuals, what actually happened. For all the very, very important structural reasons why the First World War happened, you also have contingency. It was certainly very bad luck, in inverted commas, that Franz Ferdinand was assassinated and the crisis came on just when the French are most inclined to think that their relative power in Europe and their power relatively to Russia is peaking but about to wane. There are all sorts of ways in which the summer of 1914 is a terribly dangerous moment. So there is contingency there. Because I think if Franz Ferdinand had not been assassinated, unless something else had happened, there's no reason to think Europe would have gone to war in 1914. They'd evaded it previously in the Balkan Wars. There is, though, the issue of the individual. I do believe that in July 1914, Berlin was overwhelmingly the place where the key decisions were made. And they were made by three people. Only three people really counted. One was Moltke, the chief of the General Staff. But Moltke said exactly the same in 1914 as he said in 1913 and 1912, which is, from a military point of view, it makes sense to go now. We'll win now, probably. We won't, probably, in 10 years' time. No change. The Kaiser is not the decisive figure in Berlin. I mean, he obviously, nothing which he strongly disagrees with is going to happen. But the Kaiser in 1914 does nothing without asking Bethmann Hollweg, the Chancellor. And in 1913 and 1912, Bethmann Hollweg had been the great force for peace and moderation. In 1914, he joins the war party for some reason, or at least the high-risk party. And you have to ask why. Well, there are rational reasons. Of course there are. I've already expressed them. And I do think, that having faced the agony of getting a wealth tax, the most difficult of all taxes, through the German parliament, then suddenly to find that all your efforts for the wealth tax and the expansion of the German army suddenly immediately faces a massive Russian counter-program, which you can't match. That certainly is a fully rational reason for thinking go now. But there also, I think, the psychological element. The statesman cannot be divorced from the human being. Most human beings could not manage the German system of government before 1914. It is about as dysfunctional as the American system of government now, plus. In the sense you're trying to manage, a very difficult, mercurial so-called sovereign, William II. You're trying to manage two different parliaments elected on quite different franchises, the Prussian and the German Reichstag. And you've got these nationalists baying in the wings at you. I think something snaps, and I think the reason it snaps is that Bethmann Hollweg's wife died just before the assassination. Bethmann was not a natural politician. He was more a combination of a senior civil servant and a sort of old-fashioned professor. He wasn't like Bülow, a sort of bruiser who liked the fun. And I think, he just interpreted the way that things were going, or going to go in Europe, not in a completely implausible way. It was plausible, but in the most black and pessimistic terms you could. Now, that is terrifying, and of course it's absurd, The idea that European civilization, descends into the abyss because someone's wife died. The trouble is that the great decisions when it comes to peace and war, the really crucial decisions in those worlds, are made by tiny, tiny groups of people. At which point, and in the last resort, usually by one person. You can't divorce biography from the big, big issues of peace and war. A point, of course, to make is that the Germans damn nearly did win the First World War. I think, and I think I said this before, but I say it again, they came closer than either Napoleon or Hitler, because the basic element in European geopolitics since the 1760s has been that though a would-be European emperor can conquer the Carolingian core of Europe, in other words, the Empire of Charlemagne, or the 6 founder countries of the EU, you then face a massive geopolitical challenge because you've got 2 power centres at either end of the continent. Russia beyond the Polish plain and marshes, and the British beyond the Channel. And it is enormously difficult, not impossible, that's of course the disaster, not impossible, but very difficult to mobilise and coordinate sufficient resources from the Carolingian core to take out the British maritime and Russian land peripheries simultaneously. Napoleon fails, Hitler fails. The Germans in the First World War do not fail. The Russian Revolution takes Russia out. And one of the points I think one can derive from that is that a pure blitzkrieg strategy against Russia usually fails. A crafty military political strategy undermining the legitimacy and the foundations of the Russian Empire from within is much more fruitful. I mean, the Germans in the First World War partly got there by accident. They didn't cause the Russian Revolution. They exploited it. But it is, I think, an important point. It seems to me that if the Germans had not brought the United States into the First World War, on the eve of the Russian Revolution taking Russia out, they could have won the First World War on points, not won it outright. All they needed was stalemate on the Western Front and Brest-Litovsk in the east. And that, I think, was probably within their grasp. There was no way without the Americans that the British, who were facing enormous financial difficulties by now in carrying on the war, the French, who faced big army mutinies in 1917, could win. Their Italian army ally suffers a disaster at Caporetto, and the British and French have to prop Italy up. Russia leaves the war. So I think a limited victory is within Germany's grasp, had they not brought in the United States. Crucial, as I said 2 lectures ago, would have been Ukraine. As long as Brest-Litovsk survives, and a notionally independent Ukraine, which has to be a German protectorate in order to survive, so long as that is preserved for Germany, you've basically won the First World War. Because in those days, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a great power. And if Russia is not a great power, then in one form or another, there is only one major geopolitical force in Eastern Europe, and that is Germany. So, interesting. Would it have been better? Would it have been worse? God knows. These counterfactuals are interesting to pose, impossible to answer. Handing over East Central Europe to the tender mercies of Erich Ludendorff and his friends is not a happy solution. Perhaps it is a happier solution than a Second World War, Hitler, Stalin, and the Holocaust. There is, of course, the other option, which is that Russia is one of the victor powers and is at Versailles as one of the victor powers and one of the creators of the new European order. Had Russia been a victor power and had the Franco-Russian alliance survived, you could not have had Hitler, because the French and Russians would not have allowed him to come to power. Russia would have taken a much harder line than the British when you had a reassertion of German power in the 1930s. What you got was the worst of all possible worlds, in a way. A European war which started above all else as a struggle between Russia and the Germanic empires ended with the defeat of all 3. And neither Germany nor Russia is part of the Versailles settlement or committed to it. You cannot have a stable European settlement against the continent's 2 latently most powerful polities. You certainly can't have it if the United States, without whose intervention you would never have had the victory of the Western Allies, you would never have had the Versailles settlement, then retreats into isolation and undermines that settlement. So, you know, we're talking about things which are very topical. And then, as I say, I end up talking exactly about what is topical, where the contemporary parallels come, if at all. In terms of structure, I mean, I talked about two main elements, empire and nation and the balance of power. Empire and nation is in some senses not relevant. Xi Jinping is not going to start the Third World War because he's worried about Xinjiang. You can take that for granted. In other senses, it's not so clear. I mean, look, the United States is terrifying in the sense that, you know, you have not just political division on a grand scale polarization, but it has very strong territorial elements to it. Red states, blue states. You know, God only knows what the reaction of the American polity would be to a crisis over Taiwan. You know, remember Frederick Seward, the Secretary of State in 1860 to 61, whose idea of solving the secession crisis was, one of his ideas, was possibly to start a war against the British and the French, external enemy. You know, faced by a major threat from China, would Trump cave in or would he bluster? Would he, you know, one doesn't know. But when you've got as unstable a polity and a leadership as you're likely to have in Washington and as polarized a political nation, you never know whether a threat, an external threat, is going to cause a sort of upsurge of unity at last against a foreign foe, or on the contrary, further criticism, etc., from those out of power. But I mean, this is all up in the air. Where I think, you know, you can see the obvious parallels is shifts in the balance of power. And here you can go straight back to before 1914. Mikhail Menshikov, the person I talked to, this deeply unpleasant, right-wing, highly intelligent intellectual who is he's more than a proto-fascist. He's a sort of national socialist in embryo because unlike Italian fascism, he's a vicious anti-Semite on top of everything else. But he's not stupid. And, you know, in 1908, in the context of growing Russian fears that though Germany may be the main threat now, China in the more distant future will be the main threat to Russia's position in northern Eurasia. Menshikov says the following: look, it'll take the Chinese 3 generations before they can be a threat. And by that time, the English will long since have been kicked out of India, and India will be our natural ally against Chinese hegemony in Asia. Well, you know, the exact alignments don't look like that at the moment. But the basic principle that the Industrial Revolution, modern economic power, is going to spread to continental Asia, having already established itself in island Asia, Japan, paralleling the move from island Europe, England, into the continent of Europe. That was very predictable and has proved to be entirely true. I remember right back when I was teaching briefly at Harvard in '93, long conversation with Akira Irie, who was the sort of historian of Meiji Japan and above all of Japanese-Chinese relations. And I remember I made him extremely sad, saying that it seemed to me self-evident that if the Anglo-dominated world had failed to bring in, you know, Protestant mostly, European entirely, capitalist entirely, semi-liberal imperial Germany, what chance China, which is a far more difficult task. This is an entirely different civilization. It's more powerful, potentially, than Germany for a start. It's also just more alien. Clearly, this was going to be a major challenge, and since poor Professor Urie's entire life was really rooted in the belief and the commitment to bringing China peacefully into, you know, our world order, inevitably that made him very sad, and I don't blame him, it is sad. Sometimes it's argued that economic integration will be a major factor stopping war. God willing, that's true. But, you know, war was madness from the point of view of the European economy in 1914. 43% of all Russian trade was with Germany. The German and British economies were integrating very nicely, and German industrialists were sometimes furious at nationalist lobbies and xenophobia because they said, we're conquering Europe anyway. You lot are just going to get in the way and undermine everything. There's a terribly interesting, but rather, I'm sorry, I'm croaky, moment on 25th of June 1914. For the first time ever, Sazonov, the foreign minister, rings up Nicholas II on the telephone to report the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia. And Peter Bach, who is the Minister of Finance, is just having his weekly report to Nicholas II on his own. Ministers make individual reports. And he recounts in his memoirs his conversation with Nicholas. Nicholas said that he could not believe that the Germans would risk everything when they were, in economic terms, so successful and so prosperous. And Bach said he couldn't believe it either. It was completely, as far as he could see, unthinkable. But it happened. My own view in life is that politics usually conquers economics in the last resort because we're not a very rational people. I've never believed in economics, if only because I don't know whether they're out there on the population rational spenders. I'm not a rational spender. When I go to press, they go and spend lots of money to buy a teddy bear, I won't go on about this. Then you have the argument, and here I do subscribe to it, we now have nuclear weapons. An out-and-out war between the great powers. Could that really end in anything that you could call victory? And I think, undoubtedly nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction are a major deterrent. The trouble is, I always remember that conversation between Bettmann Hollweg and his sort of great, sort of young advisor, whatever, sort of guru, Rietzler, in which Rietzler says just before the war, the European powers are so aware of the devastating consequences of a European war that one can afford to play chicken a bit and push up the stakes because in the end they'll back down. Well, of course, in a nuclear war that's even more, a sort of terrifying scenario. All right. Look, this is literally the last thing. All my books have really been about structure and agency, geopolitics at one end, the individual at the other. What is absolutely clear is that the individual usually matters most, leadership usually matters most, when the great issues of war, diplomacy, and internal crisis leading to revolution are on the agenda. It's difficult in retrospect to get into the head of Bettmann Hollweg. I knew his granddaughter quite well. That's where most of my ideas about, his mental state in 1914 come in, because I had dinner with her lots of times because she was a buddy of my aunt at Christie's. But even so, I can't be sure what was really going on in his mind. Even less can any of us know what's going on in Xi Jinping's mind. What is his priority? Is his priority getting back Taiwan? Does he, as he says, feel that this will be the great sign that that China has recovered from the era of humiliation and has regained its great legitimate position as the leading power of East Asia and one of the leading powers in the world? Or is he going to put his priority on boosting the economy so that Chinese GDP per head is first world standard? I don't know. Does he see the present situation, the way the world is going, as a window of opportunity? Or does he think, on the contrary, that the future belongs to China and he can afford to wait? I don't know either. The one thing which is certain is that if he wants Taiwan back, he's going to have to use coercion. It's not going to come to him, without an effort. And that is extremely frightening. And it sort of takes me back. I actually quite literally now sometimes have nightmares about this, to the winter of 1913-14. At that time, the Russian ambassador in London, Alexander Benkendorf, was a sort of seventh cousin 14 times removed. But the key point is I knew his granddaughter well. And I was staying with her when we opened the huge trunks of the Benkendorf archive, because he was ambassador in London, he'd got his archive with him. They included wonderful letters which went through couriers and were therefore not going to be looked at by anyone, to his brother, who was the Grand Marshal of the Imperial Court. And in the winter of 13-14, they're partly talking about, are we going to preserve peace through deterring Germany, or are we going to preserve peace through trying to conciliate Germany? And they tossed it back and forth. and on the whole they thought that probably the least bad, but by no means necessarily safe option was deterrence, showing the Germans that aggression would not pay. And actually what happened was that the Russians and French went for deterrence and the English went for conciliation. And it failed, though perhaps it wouldn't have done, I mean, if the English had gone for deterrence as well. But the trouble about that would have required a defensive military alliance with France, conscription, and a unilateral, unequivocal British guarantee to Belgium. And that was just not anywhere on any possible agenda in British politics at that time. Thinking that the First World War might have been avoided by concerted Anglo-Russo-French deterrence, does that tell you that a similar policy would avoid war over Taiwan? No. We don't know. And the very fact that we don't know, and that there are so many uncertainties, but that the consequences this time round would be a great deal more devastating than even 1914. I think actually, you know, it's a bit like accusing Abdul Hamid II of the Ottoman Sultan of being paranoid. If you were a Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, paranoia was entirely rational. I think a few nightmares nowadays are also entirely rational. God knows what's going to happen next. Good. And that's probably the last thing I'll ever say in a electoral speech in Cambridge. I think we've got, well, John will tell, I think we've got plenty of time for questions if anyone wants to ask. Or indeed, you know, statements, you know. Hell and damnation, I haven't got a pen. I'll have to remember. Is that Brendan out there?
Yes.
Hello, Brendan, yes.
Hello, yeah, thank you very much. That was terrific. The only thing I wondered about was your suggestion that the Germans had knocked the Russians out almost by accident through the revolution. Because you might argue that had been really part of their strategy throughout, and of course they sent Lenin in the sealed train and all the rest of it. So it was actually...
Brendan, of course. I fully agree with you. I didn't mean, I put it in the wrong way. What I was trying not to say was the traditional Russian nationalist argument that that the revolution was German inspired. I mean, the overthrow of the monarchy came from internal reasons. The Germans didn't have much to do with it. Once the monarchy had collapsed, then of course they go in. And actually, I think, I said this before, it's not just the sealed train. If the monarchy had come down in the revolution of 1905, the winter of 5-6, as it very nearly did, you'd have had, I think, successful European intervention spearheaded by the German army. Germany, which would have been the leading force for counter-revolution in 1905, is a huge factor in pushing the revolution to the left in 1917. And it's because the First World War gives the Bolsheviks a year's cover in which they can plant their government in the geopolitical heartland of the old Russian Empire that they win the Civil War. Of course, it's by no means the only reason. But I suspect it's probably the most important one. I think Evan Maudsley's book on the Civil War, very down to earth, but also very good, I think, in that respect. Yeah, Geoffrey.
I was just reflecting, it was a marvellous lecture, thank you very much. I'm very glad I came. But I was reflecting, of course, on the contemporary relevance of Ukraine. You rightly emphasised the huge importance of Ukraine. I thought, from sort of January, up to January 2022, that Putin had Ukraine where he wanted it. He was disrupting it, he was undermining its power, using his oligarchs and various agreements with Ukrainian oligarchs. Why on earth did he go to war? Well, as you've said, politics tends to triumph over economics, and perhaps Putin had other reasons that we don't know about. But I think he thought he was fulfilling an important historical mission to make Ukraine once again part of Russia by fair means or foul.
Yeah, no, I'm sure he did. I mean, it is also, when he gave that speech, whose statue did he have over his shoulder? Catherine II. Lavrov's comment when he was asked who were Putin's main advisors, he said Ivan Grozny, Catherine II, and Peter the Great. No, I'm sure there's a lot of that there. But he also just miscalculated. He grossly miscalculated. The frightening thing is that I'm sure he thinks now he's winning, because, you know, part of that Russo-Chinese alliance is based on contempt for democracy and a belief that democracies won't last the course, and he thinks that's going to be true. And he knows there are 4 times as many Russians as Ukrainians, and he doesn't give a damn how many poor wretched Tuvanese and peasants from the backwoods he kills off. I think he's probably wrong still, but I mean, we're on a knife edge. Tim, yes?
Yes, there's just one nagging back of my head when he was speaking is one thought about what they thought was going to happen. And, well, we know what they thought was going to happen. Das Laubfeld. And they had in their minds, or many of the decision makers had in their minds, what the last wars had been like. And the wars of the 1860s, the war of 1876, the Balkan Wars, the Japanese War of 1905, they had all been very quick.
Yeah, reasonably.
Well, we know that the First World War was not quick.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether you have taken that sufficiently into consideration when assessing what the probability was.
Tim, it's an awful thing to respond because it sounds snotty. I gave a talk on exactly that at Yale about 3 weeks ago. And it is actually fascinating. I mean, and it's also very, very well documented on the Russian side. I mean, the Russian Minister of War says to the Council of Ministers back in 1909 that it's not that we can't fight a long war, we can. You know, because Bloch's whole argument had been that Russia was uniquely favoured by the idea of a long war. But he said it's the Central Powers, particularly Germany. They can't fight a long war because, above all, their economy, but also their political system won't sustain it. And he drew that from Bloch and, of course, also, you know, a great deal of thinking of that sort. The argument being that the German economy was so dependent on international trade routes, financing, this and that and everything else, that it had got, if it was going to start a war, it had to win it quickly. And Sazonov actually says that if the Germans don't win in the first 2 months, they've lost. And he's still saying it in his memoirs later. You know, so this is a fixation on the Russian side. I think, interestingly, in Berlin, although there may be people here who know better than this than me, certainly this was what I got from the discussion in at Yale, but also from odd things, you know, I've read. I think it's very often on the German side, we must win a short war because, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in a longer war. It would be dangerous. There's actually, I mean, it's interesting that, certainly again on the Russian side, which is the one I know about, some of these military commentators are not stupid in the slightest. They've analysed even the American Civil War. They realise the enormous potential of modern defensive firepower, but they've taken the lesson from the Russo-Japanese War and from the Balkan Wars, which seems to be that if you can inculcate, this is how it's understood, if you can inculcate sufficient patriotic spirit into your troops, and if you can coordinate with sufficient military, technological, you know, genius or whatever it is, you can win quickly. And the trouble is, of course, in 1912 to 13, it seemed that they were borne out. You know, the Balkan states preempt the Ottoman mobilization and defeat Ottoman troops armed and trained by the Germans, holding quite strong defensive positions within 6 weeks. You know, so I mean, it is difficult. It's trying to predict on the basis of previous military experience has its great problems. It's, as you know, I mean, on the Western Front, it's the force to space ratio, which does for it. I mean, on the Russian front, I think it's probably more complicated. I mean, I think, well, there I think you are. You know, the Russian army was not the equivalent of the German army, not after the initial peacetime Carter was wiped out anyway. So I think it was very unlikely, actually, that the war could have been ended in 1914. But you see, again, there's a fascinating letter from Palitzin, chief of the General Staff, who says, look, Russian society this is way before the war. Russian society comforts itself by reading Tolstoy and thinking that in the last resort we have space, you know, we can always hold out, even if we have to retreat 400 miles. The trouble is, he says, none of our plans are based on that. It's not like 1812, where Alexander and Barclay de Tolly planned a strategic retreat. None of our plans, we haven't got the reserves, we haven't got the munitions, we haven't got the right communication set up. You know, we're not geared to a long war. So it's an extraordinary sort of concatenation of things. It's also true to do the ministers of war justice, that it is so difficult to get the Russian army up to scratch for a short war, particularly after the devastation of the Russo-Japanese War, since they think that is the major danger, and since the civilians have told them that the German economy and German polity won't survive a long war, they've got to concentrate on that. It's again interesting, because Stolypin and Nicholas II set up a special conference in 1908, to look into Russia's needs in the event of a future great European war. And the responses are terribly interesting, and again, by no means stupid. And the Minister of Trade, Shipov, he does an interesting analysis of all Russian imports of armaments and everything else in the Russo-Japanese War, and expenditure, all this kind of stuff. And he basically, the answer comes, is that our biggest gap is in the products of the Second Industrial Revolution. Well, that's wonderful, but there's a limit to how much you can stockpile. You can't set up, a whole string of chemical, electrical, unless there's some kind of domestic market for them in peacetime. Quite apart from anything else, the budget won't cover that. It's rather fascinating, rather terrifying too, actually. Yeah, Holger. Yeah.
I have this question, an evergreen, so to say. The Russian decision for general mobilization. So, do you think they knew what they were doing? Especially because you say they could afford a long war, so why the hurry? And suddenly everything is built up on speed.
Yeah.
So did they know what they were doing with general mobilization, or didn't they?
They knew that generalization would bring on a European war, but already 3 days before, they thought that a European war was inevitable, because they interpreted Austrian policy as being inconceivable unless the Austrians had full tilt support from Germany. Once you get into, the actual pre-war days, in the end, increasingly, it's the military who drive things, because they are the only people who know about mobilization. Mobilization is an enormously complex operation in any country. In a country of Russia's scale and weak communications system, they're paranoid, of course. And, again, they were not wrong to be paranoid. Russia was well behind even Austria, let alone Germany, in the speed of its mobilization and deployment. The Austrians were the Russians were extremely lucky. Konrad von Hötzendorf completely messed up the Austrian mobilization by firstly sending his entire reserve southwards against Serbia, and then having to get it back to fight Russia. And it never does get back, not in time. If he'd done it properly, the Austrians would have arrived on some of the key railway hubs through which Russian troops were moving and having to deploy. At that point, the Russians would have had to deploy. It's not mobilization, it's a silly word. There's mobilization, deployment, concentration. If the Austrians had not wasted those days, they could have forced the Russian deployment way back into Poland. At that point, the Russian army could not have advanced into East Prussia with the Austrians coming into its rear. At that point, the whole Franco-Russian strategy collapses. The Russians are committed to a serious attack on Germany, partly because they promised the French, but above all because they know that the German plan is to knock out France, and that if the Germans do knock out France, as of course they did in 1940, this is curtains for Russia. Then they're going to be in a sort of 1811 situation. So, the trouble is, and I'm not saying that, once you get into the military logic, which of course you do as war approaches, it becomes a question of not stopping the war, but winning it. And then the generals take over. But they only take over because even Nicholas, he's the last to give way. By the time Nicholas gives way, he's got, his foreign minister, his war minister, his senior domestic minister, the president of the Duma. They're all at him saying, you know, it's going to be like the war against Japan. We'll lose it before we've even begun. I mean, I think the wonder is he holds out as long as he does. No, I mean, my own feeling is once the July crisis begins, once the Austrians issue that ultimatum, you know, there are lots of things you can say against Sergei Sazonov as foreign minister. He was a very decent man, but second class. But actually, in the July crisis itself, it seems to me, they didn't have that many options. They would have had to make those decisions in advance. And it would not have been easy to do, but it might have been better for Russia and Europe if they had done. You know. But very easy to say in retrospect. Yeah. Hello. Yes.
So, thank you again. I mean, that was very interesting. And now I was thinking about what you were saying about the outbreak of war. And what you gave us was, I guess, the story where Germany is at the centre of this. And think about what you wrote in Toward the Flame. Of course, that starts out saying that in many ways the First World War was about Ukraine. And so I know I'm turning.
No, come on, I mustn't interrupt you. You go on, and then I'll say what I mean.
Which, of course, was not an area of interest for Germany in 1914. And I suppose I wanted to ask, it's a bit of a two-stage question, but I think they're related. The first stage is what role do what ambitions to take Eastern Galicia, as it was then, play in Russian propensities, calculations toward war, maybe not just in the summer of 1914, but in 1914 writ large. I mean, there's a lot in the newspapers talking about, from Russian ministers, about when Franz Josef dies, Eastern Galicia is ours. I mean, that then led me to think, well, as you said, Eastern Galicia and the mode of government in Eastern Galicia was something of an ideological threat to the entire Russian Empire. As the second part of the question, the first part is about calculations of propensity.
I wish I'd got a pen to write it down. I tell you, keep going, I've got one in here.
So the second part is about Russian statesmen's estimates of their own soft power strength and internal strength. Because it seems to me that internal and foreign policy, especially with regard to Ukraine in Russia, are very closely linked to this point. And I just wonder if we bring in Ukraine, if also, thinking about the Russification efforts that the Russian army makes in Ukraine during 1914 and 15, I just wonder whether one can, with Russian expansionism, or maybe not Russian expansionism, Russian security over Ukraine, over ethnic, national, imperial kind of nexus that you were talking about, whether that makes Russia more aggressive and more to blame for this more than perhaps.
Sure. I've sort of got a grasp of things. If I don't answer properly, just come back at me. I hope I said in my book that the First World War to some extent turned around the fate of Ukraine. I don't think I ever claimed that Ukraine was a major cause of the First World War. It comes dramatically over the horizon, of course, in 1917-18 itself. To everybody, well, to most people's surprise. Some of the people in Vienna were quite shrewd. But it was, it was looming, and it was looming in the heads of the most intelligent and prescient people, in a way. Struve, Menshikov, these are people looking over the horizon. It's got nothing to do with German policy making. In 1917, Ludendorff's happy to hand Galicia over to the Russians if he can get the Baltic provinces for Germany. The Austrians, of course, are a bit more aware, but I would never claim that in 1914 Ukraine is an issue, a major issue. I mean, if you're talking about Russian aggression and its impact on the Central Powers, it's Constantinople, which is much more important both ways, I think. But again, it's interesting that in this famous memorandum in February 1914, Pyotr Donavo, my hero, he, all the arguments about why, a war with Germany will bring on complete collapse and total social revolution. He does also add, and this is sniping at sort of right-wing nationalists, that the Ukrainian national movement is, in present circumstances, entirely controllable. But if we annex the cradle of Ukrainian nationalism in Galicia, then I cannot predict how dire the challenge might become. It's not quite the words he used, but I mean, it was in Russian anyway. So it's a sort of, it's there lurking in the background, and it would have become a bigger and bigger issue in time. It isn't, in any sense, the cause of the war, except to the extent that it exacerbates Austro-Russian tensions. You know, that's what I mean. Serbia is, you know, and the whole Russian involvement in the Balkans is far more of an issue for the moment. I was going to add all sorts of things, but I think I won't, because I think you had a question as well, didn't you? Yes.
About before the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? You said that Russia was economically stronger, for example, than Germany?
In 1941.
Yes.
It had a bigger share of global GDP by some distance, yes.
My question is about the factors that contributed to that.
Well, I mean, look, one very big and immediate factor is that Russia is dependent on Ukraine. Without Ukraine, it would not be a great power in 1914. By 1941, among other things, Stalin has developed the Urals West Siberian military-industrial complex, you know, and it is now the center of, really, in many ways, Soviet armaments industry. When the Germans overrun Ukraine and Western Russia, of course, that's a major shock to the Soviet economy, and they are genuinely extremely successful at evacuating industries. But if they hadn't already had their main military industrial complex beyond the reach of the Germans, they'd have been in deep trouble, as of course they would have been if the Japanese had gone north, not south. So, I mean, there are all sorts of imponderables. But above all else, that is what I meant. It is also true that, you know, the Soviet regime in 1939 to 41, or 1939 to 45, well, it is, as you might say, eliminated potential domestic opposition. You know, even so, if Hitler had operated in the way the Germans did in the First World War and had tried to mobilize anti-Bolshevik resistance in the Western borderlands and even in the Russian areas he conquered, I think, you know, that would certainly have had much better chance of victory than an out-and-out blitzkrieg. After all, Vlasov and hundreds of thousands of Russian troops fight on his side, despite the fact that Hitler means death for the Russian people. A more intelligent strategy, I think, would have had devastating results. But after all that, you know, the Nazis just weren't like that. You know, it really is a question of pigs not having wings. Yeah.
One thing which is probably really, if Russia's main aim was Constantinople and the Straits, why was it that in 1915 it was Britain who tried to seize, you know, Gallipoli?
Sure.
Did they try to coordinate with Russia? Or, I mean, and if they did, why did Russia not?
Well, Russians had no, I mean, the Russians had been trying to organize an amphibious expedition all the way back to the Balkan Wars.
Yeah.
The trouble is they didn't have the transport. And by 1915, you have to remember, they're in deep trouble on the Eastern Front. The Russian admirals, the Navy, wants to have a go. But the army says we have no troops to spare. And they were basically right. If you look at the devastating defeat of the Russian army in the summer of 1915, of course they didn't have troops to spare. They thought, I mean, they were delighted the British were having a go, but nervous what would happen if the British got Constantinople, you know, and Russia wasn't involved. I mean, but I mean, the British and French were like this as well in the Middle East. I mean, Constantinople would have been Russia. Grigory Trubetskoy, you know, I study a lot, know a lot. He would have been the first Russian governor of Constantinople if Russia had been there at the end of the war. And he was already getting pretty shirty about, you know, how he was going to treat the French and the British if they tried to push him around. So, you know, there are endless possibilities. Anyone else? Yeah.
The current Chinese regime has devoted quite a lot of time and energy into analysing the July crisis and its implications. Do you know much about how they're reading that? What conclusions?
No, David, I don't, unfortunately. I wish I did. I mean, I read one book by someone I can't by now remember, and it seemed, and it's you know, of course I don't read Chinese. He's quite a well-known Chinese historian. It seemed to me distressingly Anglo-American in its conclusions, you know, rather than imaginative. I was with Arne Westad 3 weeks ago, who's an old friend of mine. And rather worryingly, Arne, who does know such things, he believes now that actually deterrence in the short to medium term is the least, well, the most likely way to avoid war, but, you know, I just don't know. What is, I mean, very Wilhelmine is the way in which, if the Chinese really are prioritizing getting back Taiwan, does it make sense simultaneously to infuriate the Japanese over the Senkaku Islands, claim fishing rights almost into Manila Harbor so the Filipinos give the Americans a base, you know, infuriate the Vietnamese and, you know, be it semi-daggers drawn with the Indians. So now I see at this latest BRICS summit, they have come to an agreement with the Indians. And you can interpret that two ways. I don't know what's true. On the one hand, maybe it's a good sign because it shows that there is sort of rational thinking going on in Beijing and it's actually stupid to antagonize all your neighbors. Or, of course, you could interpret it the gloomy way, which is to say that if you really are going to make a push in East Asia, you want to keep as much distance between the Indians on the one hand and the Japanese and Americans on the other. So I just don't know. Whether anyone else does, I don't know either. One never knows whether these kind of ideas which float around in think tanks actually get up to the supreme leader, and if they do, in what form. And that's frightening, you know, it really is frightening. It's, you know, again, you know, the Japanese have just had an election. You know, this issue of Taiwan and if the Chinese move is literally a life and death issue for the Japanese, because the American bases, which will be essential to combating even a blockade, let alone an invasion, are on Japanese soil in many cases. They will be the targets of Chinese missiles. So, you know, tens of thousands, potentially tens of millions of Japanese people are, you know, really in existential threat if this crisis goes full tilt. They've just had an election, it wasn't even mentioned. The argument is all about whether someone's stolen 50p out of a, you know, cash till. No, I'm not laughing at the Japanese. You know, the American election is going to be decided by what, 100,000 people? Virtually none of whom will be thinking about the international situation and foreign policy, for which, thank God, really, because if they did think about it, they'd certainly get it all wrong. You know, the only thing I think which terrifies me more than the Democratic electorate is, you know, aging strongmen with their eye on a place in history. Increasingly, I think democracy is a perfect system of government if you just get rid of the electorate. You know, you know, but you know, sorry, I don't want to say that this is my last ever talk in Cambridge. I don't want to say anything too terrible.
So, at the beginning of these lectures, Boyd Hilton, who alas can't be with us today because he has a bad cold, gave a very eloquent introduction. It's my great pleasure now just to say thank you very, very briefly. Thank you not just for the lectures, for giving them, but for having been willing to give 5 lectures and an extra session, and for being around with us, and then for your generosity in staying behind to answer questions and go into them in such detail and depth. And for me, I must say, these lectures have been the sort of defining feature of this first half of the term. And I shall feel very sad when you've gone, and I already feel sad that they're over. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and thank you for all you've done. Thank you all very much for coming. Good, good.